Let us now talk about some Freudian vocabulary. Denial is rather odd in this case, in that if a person is in denial, it really means that they are not accepting anything that had happened. It's not like you saw it, you remember it, but now you're just saying that didn't happen. It's as if at the point when that traumatic event occurred, the person shuts off their short-term memory and in fact may not actually remember it. Repression, let's say, is kind of the opposite of denial. In denial, you don't really have any recollection that something has happened. Repression is where you recognize that something has happened, but you push it away. It's repressed. Projection is where you put what you feel or what you think on somebody else. You are angry, but you're telling that other person, hey, how come you're so angry? Why are you so angry? I know you're angry because I can see it in your eye. When in fact, it's not that other person, it's you. Displacement is what happens a little bit more often. Displacement is, I am mad at that person, but I'm taking it out on this person over here. So I'm really angry with this person, but because I cannot express my feeling that way, I am expressing it over here. I think a lot of people actually do that. Sublimation is kind of an unusual one where you want to do something bad, or it doesn't have to be bad, but something that you want, you can't bring yourself to do it. So you work it out in some other way. Let's say that a person is very anxious about relationships, so they can't bring themselves to get into one, but they themselves act as matchmaker for other people. And then they kind of go and ask that new couple, hey, how's it going? You know, what's going on? How's your love life? They're sort of overly interested in it because they can't bring themselves to do that thing by themselves. Psychosis is a collision between the ego and reality. So psychosis, which is actually a total break with reality, means that the ego, remember which one that is? It's the moderator, right? The moderator cannot get in sync with reality. Hence, there's a conflict that the person cannot overcome. Neurosis, however, which is normally what we think of as anxiety, is a collision between the ego, right? What's the ego again? And the id. So it's the moderator with the child, that whatever that is the child wants, the id cannot in any way actually make that happen. Let me talk for a moment about hysterical conversion, what I call, oh my gosh, my arm doesn't work. Something is so psychologically traumatizing that a person can't deal with it. But the way that they do try to deal with it is they put that trauma into a body part, and that body part then no longer works. There's nothing medically wrong with that body part, but the person will actually say, it doesn't work. I'm having trouble with it. It's not doing what I wanted to do. Libido is the electrical current that drives personality. Libido is thought of as sex drive, but it's really a quote-unquote life drive. That is, libido is involved in eating behavior, keeping yourself safe, safe from harm is also part of libido. The last one I want to talk about is transference. This is a Freudian term which means if I'm the therapist, and being a male, I'm a male, you have issues with, say, like a father figure, or maybe it's a brother, but while going through psychoanalytic therapy, you may have transference, which means you are having anger, let's say, with another male figure. You will become angry with me because I am a male figure. Now, you don't mean to, and you don't know that you're expressing it, but you are. In this part, I'm not going to actually explain every single part of the theory, but I do want to make a couple of points. Id, the first one, is Latin, and it actually means child. So when we talk about the id, we're actually just talking about the child. This part is very impulsive. The superego is actually all about regulations, steps, what's correct. The ego is the part that tries to make peace between the id and the superego. You can think of the id and the superego as opposites, and the ego is trying to find a balance between those. This is the levels of the mind. There's a very famous analogy about an iceberg. Icebergs, most of what the iceberg is not visible from the surface of the water. So the unconscious is very, very small. In Freud's theory, most of the reason why you do things is because of things that are happening in the unconscious. So the unconscious is the largest part. It's this sort of boiling cauldron of things that are affecting you that you are not ever going to be aware of. And in fact, Freud said that if you were aware of what was going on in the unconscious, you would be so shocked and horrified at yourself that you would probably no longer be able to function. The preconscious is actually very small also. And this is your boundary level, so to speak, between awareness and unconsciousness. The problem is the preconscious does not really know very much. It's like you've told a very long story to someone, and then when you repeated, when you ask them, please repeat back what I said to you, all they can remember is, you told me this is really important and I should remember. But they didn't remember anything of the story that you told them. And that's important. Things that you get in dreams, things that you get in what they would call Freudian slips, tend to come from the preconscious. But the preconscious is itself very small. 3. What I'd like to talk about in this session is psychoanalysis, or the psychodynamic point of view, and Sigmund Freud. And before we go on too much farther, you think, oh my gosh, Sigmund Freud, he's that crazy guy. All he ever talked about was sex, and he was really hung up. He used cocaine. What kind of a goofball, is that? Freud actually comes in, I talked about the first, second, and third force. The third one being cognition, the second one probably being behaviorism. Freud actually comes in a little bit before that and kind of a little bit after that. So why isn't Freud the second or third force or the factor? And the reason is because Freud kind of fades away. There's not a lot of Freud left. But things that he did create that are still around are very significant. Psychotherapy, defense mechanisms, and some other things. The importance of dreams in analysis. So I like to think about Freud in terms of like the Wright brothers. Not too long ago, well, maybe it was a while ago, I believe it was the Smithsonian wanted some engineers to actually rebuild the Wright Flyer and recreate that first manned flight, or powered flight, I guess you could say. Well, what happened is the engineers realized that the Wright Flyer was so unstable that they were afraid that it might hurt somebody on its first flight. So they modified it a little bit. So, they still talk about the Wright brothers today, but the Wright brothers still make airplanes. Is the Wright Corporation the predominant maker of aircraft now? And the answer would be no. But they were the first ones to do it. Well, I feel that way about Freud. There were some very significant things that Freud did that nobody else had done. And yet, Freud's kind of really thought of as just some kind of kooky guy who had a lot of sexual ideas, and none of that is really important anymore. Well, that's not quite the case. He was the first one to really explore personality, talking about the ego, the superego, the levels of consciousness in the mind, the iceberg analogy. He was the first one, and I think this is one of the major ones, to talk about talk therapy, which was actually pioneered by Brewer, but we can talk about that later. The idea that you talk about your problems without medication, without surgery, without having to bleed you, and that you get over it, you get better. He had the first application to abnormal behavior, that is, someone's functioning is not functioning normally. He could apply some of his principles and get them to some extent back to quote-unquote normal, whatever normal is. And he was one of the first to emphasize childhood experiences. He went to medical school. He focused on biology, neurology, biology and then neurology. He was doing psychoanalysis on Anna O when he made some of his biggest breakthroughs about hysterical conversion and the talking cure. Why is he controversial? He talked about the unconscious. If I tell you, the reason you're doing this is because you have unconscious urges, can I prove that? Well, no, because they're unconscious. And if I tell you, is that the truth? You're just going to deny it because you don't know it either. That means it's never really provable. He talks about sexual motivation. Even the people who really believed in his theories very much did not like that part of his libidinal drive. Freud was almost a cult leader. People who believed in him really, really believed in him. And if you verbally said, I don't believe you anymore, he would sort of excommunicate you, and you really couldn't come back to be an analyst anymore. So you were either with him or you were against him. But he did drum up quite a following. He used cocaine, and he used cocaine on his patients too. Probably not the best thing. He talked about being a scientist first and foremost. But if you look at a lot of his theories, you can't really prove anything. If I say, this is what your dream means, how do I know? How can I prove that? Usually there's a causative factor and then a behavior that we can identify that comes right after, like pain and ouch, or pain and you move away. But in this case, Freud's looking at the end behavior, and then he's saying, well, because this is this end behavior, this must be the causative effect, the causative stimuli. But you can't prove that it's there. So that he wasn't really as much of a scientist as he said. After the death of Freud's father, he started analyzing himself. And it's interesting that he should be thinking about dreams, fantasy, and exploring those right after the death of his father. Makes me kind of wonder what was going on there. Perhaps there was something that, perhaps some of his theories applied more to him than to other people. That's what I'm trying to say. In like 1923 or 25, Freud got cancer of the jaw, I believe it was. Perhaps from smoking, or perhaps it was genetic, I'm not sure. He lived with that cancer for about 15 years, and then in 1938 or 1939, just a little bit about after the Second World War started, he overdosed on morphine on purpose. He had a doctor, and I believe his daughter was there. I'm not going to explain this whole thing one by one, but I wanted you to be at least comfortable in understanding what each section is called and what the focus is. I think it's the second one that I want to spend my time talking about, is that there's actually, if I remember correctly, there's two kinds of bad ways that you can end up with toilet training. One is the retentive, that is someone who refuses to release anything until they are ready to, and someone who completely holds on would be someone who is like a hoarder, someone who keeps useless things. And I can't remember what the other one is called, but the other one is like just dumps out everything and doesn't hold on to anything at all. I can't remember what that one's called, but the more severe the toilet training, the more likely it is that a bad outcome will occur, and the young person will get stuck in that particular stage. The other one that I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on here is latency. With all these libidinal urges, why is it that young school children do not show hardly any of these urges? And what Freud says is that during the latency stage, that the person pushes them away, represses their libidinal energy to focus on socialization. So it's socialization which is the most important, actually, in this particular point, not libidinal energy or erogenous zones. Freud actually said most people don't get here, that most people cannot make it through all of the 5 stages without getting stuck somewhere, and that getting stuck is called a fixation. His theory was, oh my gosh, edit that part, okay. Darn it.